So to look at, why would we go and partner? And the reason is because there's value to be captured with some strategic suppliers. And what we're going to talk about is an idea whereby we look at the business drivers, the value of your organisation to be in partnership with someone else. And that's driven by, one, the business drivers and the value, and two, whether you're actually going to be capable of being in partnership with someone. So that means they're similar to you, culture, style, size, geography, etc. So the source of this research is the Supply Chain Management Institute, and there's a guideline called the Partnership Facilitators Guide, and the author is Professor Doug Lambert, who some of you may know, but it's about developing and implementing successful partnerships in the supply chain, and I've been using it for about 10 years. So the question here is for each organisation how to work out who they should partner with. And what I've done here is just provided an example of a technique called product portfolio analysis, which actually just breaks up your supply base into these 4 categories based on the percentage of spend in dollars and then the strategic risk to the business if the supplier fails. And typically what we're looking at are people in this 4th quadrant, which is high risk and high spend, and they're sometimes the showstoppers. If that supplier actually fails, it has a dramatic impact on your success. And they're the sorts of organisations that you need to have more strategic relationship with, relationship that may have 5 or 6 levels to it. So there might be a CEO connection and a director level and senior management, middle management, and then process workers, for example. Now, just by me saying that tells you it's going to be expensive to be in relationship to these people compared to someone in box 1, which is totally transactional, there's no risk and it's low spend. You go to the shop and you buy it and there's no relationship. So that's where you've got to link the effort you're going to put in to develop a partnership relationship with the value you can get out. So you can go away and look at that product portfolio analysis and identify some suppliers that you'd like to be more strategic with. And so once you've done that, you can apply this partnership model which comes out of the Developing and Implementing Successful Partnerships in the Supply Chain by Doug Lambert. And what you do is once you've identified an organisation that you'd like to partner with, and that can be you the client or you the third-party provider, invite them to come to a workshop, and the challenge is to identify the strategic drivers that are your compelling reasons to partner, and we'll go through these in a little bit more detail. So each organisation does the drivers separately, and then together they do the facilitators, and they're the things that will make this relationship a partnership if there is value as determined by the drivers and the facilitators together. So in the middle there, number 3 is a decision to create or adjust the relationship, and it may well be a type of partnership, and we'll come to that in a moment. But the whole idea of working out whether we've got the right relationship is then expanded into the number of components and the types of components that we need that nurtures this partnering relationship. And obviously the whole idea of doing a partnership is to get value from it in your organisation. So point 5 is the outcomes, the extent to which performance actually meets expectation, the link between whether the drivers identified at the beginning are actually right and delivering that value to you as an organisation. And I've been involved in a number of these relationships whereby we start with identifying drivers and then being able to measure the outcomes based on the components developed. And obviously there's a feedback process that reviews the drivers and the facilitators. So just a little bit more detail. strategic drivers we've done individually. We do the facilitators as a group. That determines the value. That then determines the type of relationship we want to pursue, and then we can look at the types of partnership components that we need to implement to get that value promised. And that then identifies the types of sharing of resources and collaborating. And I've got there obviously from master servant to process flow amongst equals. And one of the questions that came out of the expectations was the need to develop a level of trust early on in the process. And that's absolutely critical. And we'll come to that as we proceed through this webinar. And like everything else, we need to be able to measure success. We need to have joint ways of understanding success of the partnering relationship. And obviously it needs to be working for both organisations if a partnership will continue long term. So here's one example of a project that I've done, and you can see that the drivers equate to 20 for the third party provider and 18 for the client, and the ones that are to the right of those fours indicate the possibility of a strategic advantage in this area if we develop a partnership relationship with this other organisation. So what this told us was that from a driver perspective for both organisations, opportunity was significant in terms of value. If we then look at whether our organisations are similar, we look at the types of facilitators that are presented, and you can look at those categories down the left-hand side as it was for the drivers. And once again, the facilitators is a relatively high score, and then what you do is, so a summary, the drivers for the third-party provider was 20, for the client 18, for the group facilitators it was 20, and that gets plugged into what's called this table, which has the driver points, so 20 and 18, that both lives in the right-hand side in the yellow type 3, bottom right. And then if we look at facilitators, which is 20 points, that also lives on that bottom line. So this process identified that these two organisations, if they developed a partnering relationship that used all the components that we're going to talk about, there would be a type 3 partnership and strategic value to both organisations. So the challenge then was for these two organisations to deliver that value to both the organisations, and that was the relationship journey that I was with them, and I was the strategic collaboration broker, in effect, keeping them both on track. So, as I said, we work out the type of relationship. That it tells us what sort of planning components that we need in the relationship to deliver the value that has been identified. So these are the 8 areas that both organisations then work on. What type of planning, what sort of joint operating controls, communications, risk and reward sharing. So there's a continuous improvement focus from both organisations. How much trust and commitment do we need for this relationship to deliver the value promised? What sort of contract style? How will the scope expand? So for a third-party provider, if it's successful, they may win more work from that client. And what sort of financial investment is required, and how do we do that? Do we do that together? I know in some partnering relationships, the client supports the third-party provider with finance that they have at their fingertips to reduce the cost of equipment, vehicles, etc. that can be purchased. I remember that was done with Kalari and Bungie in the 1990s. So, as a summary, what we're talking about is type 1 partnership, type 2, type 3 or arm's length, and the level of effort you put into the components is determined by the value you're going to get. Okay, and that's something that the both organisations can then rank and implement based on the value. So we haven't spoken much about relationship yet, because obviously to get to this point there needs to be the development of relationship to such a degree where there's trust in both organisations, and obviously that's part of the facilitators. But strategic intent is very important if we're going to go into some sort of partnering relationship. So I've mentioned there aspects like capability, mindset. So, you know, do we have any experience in terms of being collaborative? The legal requirements, so we need to be very careful that the legal people don't take the process over and create an adversarial environment. The truth is that the relationship should be driven by the memorandum of understanding or the heads of agreement and not the other way around. The truth is that risk drives the legal eagles to almost create adversarial environments. So a real challenge for collaborative lawyers to get involved here and to get involved together early on with the project team. So then the collaborative agreement can be something that's congruent with the intention. Not something that happens a lot, but does exist. So what we've got is a methodology for delivering the value, and it can tell us where we need to start and who should be involved, because it may well be that for one party it's a type 3, but for another party it's a type 1, and that would help us allocate resources to the development of that value. And obviously we need those KPIs which we've mentioned. And we need to build this relationship capability. So in a lot of my work I do a number of simulations and a number of conversations to nurture relationship capability, and I'll speak about that now. So I've just given one example, one methodology that I've worked with, which was called co-sourcing alliance. So we put together this idea of the first step is to build a healthy relationship between the client and the third-party provider, and much of that is how are we going to fight. And my philosophy is let's have one bunker, not two bunkers, when the problems arise, because there will always be problems, as there is in life. So after having those conversations about how we're going to deal and how we want to be with each other, we need to ask the question, are we still committed to this partnering relationship? But remember, it comes from building a healthy relationship already, and we have a heads of agreement that actually details a memorandum of understanding of how we're going to work together. So obviously the next bit in this partnering is to get the commercials right. So obviously the partnering workshop that we've just spoken about, I've conducted. You can see on the left-hand side there I run a simulation called Red Blue, which is a fantastic education tool for people who are focused on partnering, and I would encourage people to use it. I'm going to give you a link to my book which details Red Blue in detail, and I'm very happy to come and talk to people if they'd like to conduct it in their own organisations. But it's a fantastic tool to develop partnering capability and collaborative capability. So in here you can see that we're saying that we're going to build collaboratively, that means together, the client and the 3PL, a cost model that's transparent to both parties. We have the costs, real costs. It's an open book environment, and real open book, not pretend. And there's only one set of books. Now to do that, the third party has to trust the client that they're not going to be abused. So we're actually we're breaking down a master-servant relationship to one where we can work as equals. So as I said, not for the faint-hearted, and this is an iterative process. It's not we get it right once and that's it. We're always working on it, always working on relationship, perhaps like our friendships and our intimate relationships. We can't just sign up and do nothing thereafter and expect everything to be right. So the last bit here is the successful implementation, which is obviously the most important part, and that's a continuous communication process. I do a lot of conflict capability work here and ensure people can resolve conflict without destroying the relationship, but we need it to be robust and we need it to be focused on the issue and not the person. And so much of my work is how to fight fair, and as I said, in one bunker, not two bunkers, and trusting each other that we can work it out no matter what happens. So I just provide this as a sort of picture of the transition from traditional contracts to more collaborative ones, and you can see some of these aspects are about the sort of information that's shared. And on the collaborative one, we're looking at a common picture of success. In the collaborative one, we tend to get to know each other more than just professionally. So we need to actually know each other so we can work with our strengths and weaknesses. And in any high performance environment, we actually consciously work with our weaknesses. It's very easy to work with our strengths. It's the stuff of champions who work with their weaknesses openly and actively. As I've spoken about, the third point is about conflict. The fourth one is about organisational aims. And so for successful partnering, we need to have clear intentions and joint strategic aims, and often joint values and behaviours in terms of how we're going to behave. Now the next one, Dan, is this idea about two bunkers versus one. What I realise is that people sometimes follow the rules in traditional contracts, but in collaborative ones, we actually know the rules that have to be broken. And that is a reality in collaborative environments, because the organisational system is not geared for collaboration, it's geared for minimising risk. And if you minimise risk, you never take a chance. And so it is a different environment to be working in. There's a real challenge in terms of sharing confidential information. So in the collaborative, we tend to share much more, but we're far more conscious of what is really confidential. People involved in these third-party provider contracts, if you don't trust someone, you never take action and deliver work without having the dollars sorted out. But in a collaborative one, you trust that the commercials will be sorted out, and your challenge is to resolve operational issues for the client. And as long as that client then respects you as the provider of transport or warehousing and pays for it, then the relationship continues in a high trust environment that then enables the organisation to work in a seamless flow. I mentioned a little bit this second last one, which was master-servant relationship. We tell the third party, or we tell the client, and there's limited interest in the other organisation, whereas in the partnering one, collaborative one, we're actually pursuing a quality, and we actually look after each other, and we care about whether someone's making a profit. And if they don't make a profit, that's not going to work. But we also don't charge too much and gouge. So there is a relationship that's quite mature about profit and margin. And the last one is whether we're in this sort of a win-lose or whether we're in a win-win relationship. And so they're the sorts of things that transition from traditional contracts to a more collaborative one.